Hello, everyone. How are you all doing today? Excellent. What's another cold morning out here outside of Taranga Commons and all of the residence buildings. So I think after reading week, I'm going to have to find a place to do this from inside. But speaking of, this is our last lecture before reading week, so I'm sure you're all anxious to get going. So let's do that. Today we're going to be talking about universals. So we're going to just kind of start the unit, hopefully get halfway through, talk about what universals are, or and really, most this will mostly be our concern for the second part of this unit, but our concern will be, well, firstly, whether they exist. We'll talk about nominalism, which denies that they exist. And then we'll take a look at various other conceptions on which universals do exist, but not as the sort of thing that we're going to learn about today. So, first of all, what is a universal? In a lot of our discussions in this course so far, we've had occasion to talk about what we could call particular things or particulars, as well as universals, even though we haven't explicitly, discussed them as such. So, particular objects, right? We could make an utterance. We could utter a sentence like, "This dog has a blue collar," or "This apple is green," right? Those utterances refer to particular objects, a particular dog, a particular apple. Actually, oddly enough, there's a random orange over there on the picnic table. Um, I don't really want to get up and grab it. I don't know how long it's been there. But if I say that orange is on the picnic table, I'm referring to that particular orange. And I'm picking out some properties that it has, like being on the table. So when we talk about particulars, we're talking about particular things, particular beings, not necessarily living beings, but like things that exist, right? That orange, this coffee cup, the dog, the apple, etc. But we can also talk about universal things, right? We can say something like dogs are mammals or apples are fruits. So here I'm referring to kinds of things, right? If I say dogs are mammals, I'm talking about the kind, dog. Mm. If I say apples are fruits, I'm talking about the kind of fruit that is an apple. So when we talk about kinds, we're talking about universals, right? We can also distinguish between the objects that we're talking about and the properties that they have. So some apple might have the property of being green. So might a pear or an avocado, right? In each case, we have different instances of the same color, which is green. So we can say of these properties, in this case, green is the property, that properties are predicatable or predicable of different objects. So I can say that apples, pears, avocados, cars, certain Muppets like Kermit the Frog here, leaves of grass, etc. Any green object or any green thing can instantiate a property, in this case, green. So what it means to say that properties are predicable of their of the objects that bear them is that, like if you were to put it in a sentence, the property, the word that refers to the property is a predicate. So the apple is green. Kermit the Frog is green, right? Um, we're predicating the property green to those things in those sentences. And that is why we can think of properties as predicable of objects. Um, and many different objects, as the example I've just used shows, can instantiate the same property. The property, Jaden, is what is more universal. That is the universal. In this case, green is our universal. But all of these green leaves on that tree over there, those are all particular things, but they all instantiate the same property, which is a universal, namely green. So what I was just doing is something called abstract reference. So if I say green is a color, or Kermit the Frog is a Muppet, what I'm doing is using abstract reference. I'm referring to the properties, like green being a color. I'm saying that's a color. Green is a color, not an object. So whenever I refer to a property, that is something called abstract reference, because green, if it's a universal, and if universals exist, universals are not something concrete like the objects that instantiate those properties. Right? Think about it. If I look across the way there and I look at that tree, I can see a lot of green leaves fluttering around in the wind. I can say, look at that leaf over there and compare it with this other leaf next to it. Right? There I'm talking about concrete things, um, actual physical objects. But the properties that they instantiate are abstract, right? I could, for example, take one of those leaves and tear it up, right? I've destroyed the leaf. I could burn the leaf, but I haven't destroyed the greenness, right? Um, Green still exists in the abstract. You can think of like Plato's forms if you want to make an analogy here with something abstract, and we will actually get to Plato in a moment. But that's abstract reference. Well, it's not really to do with we're not really worried about the brain, right? I mean, you could kind of make this sort of argument, and we will get to this when we talk about substance, when we're talking about things, but you could make an argument kind of like along the lines that Locke did, where maybe these secondary qualities are mental rather than physical. But we don't need to worry about that right now. So that's abstract reference. Is everybody clear on this idea of abstract reference? So if I say, the green is a color, I'm not talking about any particular instance of green. I'm talking about the universal green. That's abstract reference. We can also have different instances of the same property, like the example with the leaves show, or all of the green objects I named on the previous slide, right? Some apples, pears, cucumbers, broccoli, avocados, those are all green. Some Muppets are green. Some cars are green. Leaves are green. Both the blades of grass and the leaves in the trees, many of those are green. So they all share an attribute, the attribute of being green. And this is called attribute agreement. Now, all of this has been quite like I appreciate who was it that asked the question? It was Khalid. Khalid, that was a good question asking about um the brain. But really, and this is kind of maybe a little understated in Crumley's chapter on this, but this is really got a lot to do with language and the way we talk about um, universals, the fact that we can talk and think in terms of abstract reference and attribute agreement raises a philosophical problem. And that philosophical problem is the problem of universals, namely, what are universals and do they exist? And if they do exist, what are they like? So, and a lot of our problems here, it's going to come down to really language problems with how we talk. See, we've got a question in the chat here. Well, I wouldn't say that. Um, Possibly. But then again, I'm maybe not the best person to answer this question because, well, I don't really speak any other languages. Could a language just not have universals? I don't think so. I think it's a feature of natural language. But can we come up, is there an example? Maybe we can try and, for somebody who speaks another language, um, is there, like if you speak a language other than English, do you agree that you can think and speak in terms of attribute agreement and abstract reference? Oh, okay. No, Galen saved us the trouble. There aren't any. Yeah. Because how could language work, right? If it did work that way, how could we think? If it actually did work that way, we wouldn't be able to think in the abstract, which would be, well, I suppose problematic, wouldn't it? Ooh, it's awfully cold out here today. Maybe if I turn my back this way, it's, then my hair goes crazy in the wind. It's awfully windy. Oh, it just got windy, windier. Ooh. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about attribute agreement. Instances of the same property can occur in different places at different times, right? Um, we kind of group them together because to us they share something in common. The attribute in question. Again, with green, you can group, I don't know, Granny Smith apples, pears, and avocados together um, because they share this common attribute, which is greenness, being green, right? And we could say that the pear, the cucumber, and the avocado and the apple, um, each of them instantiates green, just like Kermit the Frog or this grass in front of me. Um, and we can do this with abstract things too, not just. I know I was talking about abstract reference earlier when I say, like, okay, green is a color, but we can do this with abstract things as well, just rather than physical objects. We can talk about the attributes that abstract things have in common with one another, not just the attributes that physical objects have in common with one another, is I suppose what I mean to say. So think of something like virtue or courage, right? We might think, this particular firefighter is courageous. This particular soldier is courageous, right? Both of them instantiate um, courage or virtue, right? Which I won't say much about because we're going to get to another example of that in a moment from Plato's Meno. But all of these things are shared by the things that instantiate them. But we want to say, or it seems, that the properties exist over and above the objects, right? So courage exists, and this is quite a sort of Platonist or Platonic sort of view. Courage exists over and above the courageous individual. And if they do really exist, these things would be universals. So universals are these sort of things that exist over and above the objects which instantiate them, and they can be instantiated by various objects or various beings. Particulars cannot be instantiated. Particulars are what instantiate the universals. So particulars are kind of unique in that sense. And of course, yeah, I mentioned Plato a moment ago. And I think if you want to really get an idea of what all of this means, you can think of Plato's forms or Plato's ideas, right? The intelligible forms. Um, for Plato, they have more reality than physical things in our world, but we can understand them as universals. So here's an example from the Republic where the character Socrates is talking with Glaucon. That's Plato's brother. And Socrates says, "We speak of many beautiful things and many good things, and we say that they are and so define them in speech." Glaucon, of course, agrees, "We do." And Socrates continues, he says, "And beauty itself and goodness itself, And so, with all the things which we then classed as many, we now class them again according to some form of each. Glaucon, that is so. So, these forms, the good, the beautiful, the virtuous, etc., they exist kind of over and above good things or beautiful things. Um, in fact, they for Plato, they don't just exist over and above these things. They're actually more real than those things. You know, to make it really concrete, think of this cup, right? This cup, if you're a Platonist, gets its reality from the form of the cup, which is a sort of perfect idea of a cup, and it's more real than this cup. Oh, interesting. Where's that language spoken, Galen? According to your search, um, where would what's the community of speakers like? Oh, is it not a natural language? Ah, okay, that would be why. So I guess I should revise the claim then. The claim is that no natural language lacks ways to talk about um, attribute agreement. No language lacks abstract reference. Yeah. So we're talking about natural language, like which is the kind of language, well, like English, basically any language people speak that's not constructed, like this Toki Pona or Esperanto, right, is another example, or fictional languages. Right, there are lots of fictional languages. They're all constructed, but natural language, Spanish is absolutely a natural language. Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. All of them. No, no, it's okay. I'm not laughing at you. I thought maybe you were making a joke. Yeah, all natural languages. Like so, you know, languages kind of develop naturally, and language is like a natural feature of, you know, our linguistic abilities are like a natural ability that we have. If you sit down and make up a language, that's a constructed language. But English, Spanish, French, Japanese, all of them, any language you can think of. Yeah, that's possible, but for our purposes, I mean, what can we do with that? If maybe there was a language that didn't have abstract reference or didn't have ways to talk about attribute agreement, even if it didn't have words for that, there's still the whole question of pragmatics, right? There are contextual ways that meaning can change in languages that lack certain words. Um, like in a lot of Asian languages, that there's not really a singular plural distinction. You just know whether you're referring to one thing or many things based on the context that you're speaking in, right? Um, yeah, yeah, there are whole language groups, although not as separately as you'd think. I mean, if I told you that English and Hindi were related, you might be surprised, but they are. They are actually distant cousins. Um, I think Chomsky's got. I mean, I don't necessarily go as far as Chomsky does. I don't know that universal grammar is innate, but I think that it's quite likely that the means of acquiring grammar are innate. There's a paper about this by Alison Gopnik, which I really like. You can really captures what I think about this. So maybe I'll share it over the Discord server. Yeah, yeah, Galen. I don't think there's any natural language that lacks ways to talk about attribute agreement or to make abstract reference. Um, okay. But before we get too distracted, um, let's talk about what universals are and the various positions you can take toward their existence. So, some philosophers, like Plato, would hold that um, universals exist. So this is realism. So remember, and we got into this a little bit last time. When when in philosophy you say that something is real, what you mean is that it exists mind independently and that it's publicly accessible by other minds, right? So this is a view that says universals really exist mind independently. So Plato was a realist. In fact, sometimes we call this view Platonic realism, right? After all, he believed that his perfect forms were more real than the things in our world. The things in our world are like mere shadows cast by the forms. And if you want to get the idea, you should read The Allegory of the Cave, which also comes from the Republic, where Socrates is describing to Glaucon the philosopher's journey from ignorance to knowledge. And of course, for Plato, that involves acquiring knowledge of the forms. Or acquiring isn't really the right word because Plato thinks that knowledge of the forms is innate, but we don't need to worry about that little detail right now. But let's call the Platonist view strong realism about universals, right? Universals really exist independently of the mind, and they're publicly accessible, right? I can look at those green leaves and I say, oh, look at those leaves. They're instantiating green. And you can do the same, all things being equal. Maybe people with certain forms of color blindness can't do this, but all things equal, that green is there for anyone to look at it and remark, oh, those leaves are instantiating the property of green, right? So that's strong realism. The very opposite of this is a view called nominalism. Nominalism, think nom, name, name. Nominalism says that universals don't exist. Only particular things and particular occurrences of particular properties exists. This is associated with William of Ockham. So you've likely heard of Occam's razor, right? This is usually given two different ways, and we'll talk about this more when we get back from reading week. But Occam's razor says, um, well, there's two formulations. One is the simplest answer is most likely the correct answer, and the other formulation, which is often given as the principle of parsimony, says, do not multiply entities beyond necessity. And this means theoretical entities. So on nominalism, we're not going to multiply our entities beyond necessity. Sure, there's this green over there, and there's the green of those leaves, and the green of those leaves, and the green of the leaves on that bush and on that tree and this grass. But those are all just particular occurrences of particular instances of green. There is no universal green. What we think is a universal, and here's where you really start to see the language stuff coming into play again, is really just a word that we have. It's like a class. We categorize all these things into a class based on their similarity, but that does not mean that green exists over and above all of the green objects, right? So those are kind of like the extreme ends of the spectrum on universals. And then in the middle, you've got moderate realism and conceptualism. So on moderate realism, universals exist, but not as separate sorts of objects that are over and above the particular instances. Rather, they exist in the objects. So this is associated with Aristotle. So where Plato said, sure, universals exist, but they're more real than the particulars which instantiate those properties. Aristotle would say, well, universals exist, but it kind of exists not over and above, but within each and every thing that instantiates the property. Then there's conceptualism. This is associated with Peter Abelard, the medieval French thinker. And on this view, universals are just concepts. They're just like ideas. mental objects. They're universal in the sense that they can refer to many different to properties that many different individual things share, but they don't exist in the objects. They don't exist over and above the objects. Rather, they are mental items, mental objects. Okay, any questions? Oh, it's so cold. It's so cold out here. If there are no questions, I'm going to try and power through as quickly as we can, simply because it's so cold. Ooh. So universals are like a special kind of object, especially if you're a realist, right? If you're a realist, you think that these universals exist independently from the objects which instantiate them. They exist separately from their instances, you could say. So if I had a Granny Smith apple with me, which I don't, but if I had one and I ate it, then I have destroyed the apple. Like let's say I'm really hungry and I just destroy the apple, literally, like nom 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 nom. The apple is gone, but I haven't destroyed green, the color. I've only destroyed one instance of green. And a realist would even say, even if you had infinite time and you could go about the entire universe and destroy every instance of the color green, if you were like Thanos and you could just snap your fingers and make all green objects disappear, a realist would say the color green still exists. Even if there were no green objects, even if there were no instances of the property uh, in question. But even though universals and particulars are distinct, Crumley says the universal is wholly present in each instance. And this is important. It's important to note for when we get onto our discussion about nominalism that this is different from being a member of a class, right? Even if we take this literally, like imagine a philosophy class like this one. You're present in the class, but the entire class is not present in you, the individual student. But with a universal, the universal green is wholly present in a green object, such as a Granny Smith apple or Kermit the Frog. Does that make sense? Make sense to you? All right, I'm not getting any questions, so I assume we're good so far. Ooh. Realists will also say that universals are certainly not physical. They're not made of anything. They're not made of matter. They don't take up any space. They don't have extension. Likewise, they're not made out of energy. They're not physical. They're not made up of the parts of the physical world. And so we can have different universals instantiated in the same object, right? And different objects can instantiate the same universal. Remember, that is attribute agreement. So I can have a green apple and I can have a green avocado, and they both instantiate the same universal. But I can also have different universals instantiated in the same object. Maybe my green apple instantiates green, but it also instantiates tartness, right? You know how those Granny Smith apples are a little sour? It instantiates green, it instantiates tartness, it instantiates roundness, and solidity, and indeed like many other properties at the same time as it instantiates green. This is called multiple instantiability. Can you think of some other examples of multiple instantiability? Yeah, like I would just say thirst or pain. These are properties that certain things can have, right? Um, I could, and you know what, Khalid? I could be thirsty and in pain at the same time. Like that's not impossible. In fact, that happened once. I remember I was making ramen. This was like 3 years ago. I was making some ramen late at night, and I wasn't being careful. And when I took the pot off the stove, it was like instant ramen, right? So I was boiling the water, and I took the pot off the stove, and I just kind of moved it too fast. Some of that water splashed on me, got this really nasty burn. And so I woke up in the morning, and obviously I was still in pain, but I was also really thirsty. You know, when you first get up, or maybe not everyone's like this, but when I first get up in the morning, I'm always like really thirsty. So there I was in pain and very thirsty at the same time, right? So that's multiple instantiability. Um, but remember, multiple instantiability also refers to the idea that different objects can instantiate the same property. So, like, I could be thirsty and you could also be thirsty, right? And abstracts. Okay, so that's a good example. And abstracts are non-physical, so we don't actually discover them by the senses if you're a realist. And this also, like, I know we haven't directly read Plato. We've just kind of been looking at little quotes from here and there from various dialogues. But Plato called the forms intelligible because he believed that they were known by the intellect, not the senses. Descartes does something similar with substances or with objects and their properties. With the wax exercise, which I think you can read about in his second meditation. So, if you're looking for something to read over the break, um, get into some Plato or something. Yeah, you could think about it that way, right? Like objects in a computer program. If you're using object-oriented programming, right? And I'm not an expert on this by any means. Like I don't code, even though I've got friends who tell me I should learn to code. I say, but I'm already doing philosophy. I don't want to have to learn to code. But yeah, imagine you're like writing something in Python, right? Which is an object-oriented language, and you can create an object. You can use your code and you can write a script and make an object, and you can assign properties to that object. But that object can instantiate multiple different properties at the same time. And of course, you can create other objects which might have similar properties, right? So, yeah, if you're a coder, this is like what you do when you do object-oriented programming, except we're talking about metaphysics, right? Rather than lines of code. So it's very similar, actually. Good insight. I don't know why is C sharp scary? I don't know. I don't know enough about it. Yeah. Oh, you can have an object. So it sounds like an abstract object is what what we're here calling a property, maybe. Again, I don't know enough about coding to see how well this analogy fits, but I think you're on the right track, Daniel. It sounds to me like you're on the right track with your comparison. Okay, so universals are also non-physical. If you're a realist, they're discovered by the senses. They're not discovered by the senses. Sorry, ignore that. They're discovered by the intellect. Plato and Descartes agree on this. This is what makes them rationalists, right? Go back to that old rationalist empiricist distinction. So, what are some abstract universals that we can think of here? Oh, interesting, Nicholas. Yeah, I'm learning a little about computer science here. But what are some abstract objects that are universals? Oh, we don't have. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. I'll fix that after class. Yeah, justice. Great. That's a good one. Justice. Like How do you know if an action is just or unjust? Well, you don't look at it. Well, you don't just look at it. You have to think about it, right? So whether an act is just or unjust requires the exercise of the intellect, for you to like make a judgment on it. You don't just smell it and go, smells like justice, right? That's not how it works. What are some other examples? I wish it were that easy. That'd be a good, maybe we could have a superhero that has some kind of super smell for justice, and that's what they do, right? Go around sniffing out injustices, like literally sniffing out injustices. Yeah, Batman maybe, but I don't know. Is Batman a platonic realist? I'm not sure. I would say maybe. Like Batman has a sense of justice, but that's not like a physical sense. That's like something he does by exercising the intellect, right? What are some other kinds? Would all social contracts qualify, constructs rather, qualify as abstract universals? Um, some of them might. That's a good question. Yeah, some of them might. Some of them seem pretty concrete, like money, like currency seems pretty concrete, right? But then again, a realist is going to say, like, hey, maybe some of those social constructs aren't constructs at all. They're like real abstract universal things. Um, um, like what's an example? Well, justice is an example. I mean, we could say like, oh, we make up the rules for what is just and what is unjust. But then someone else who's a realist could say, no, you don't. Uh, Justice exists over and above the particular instances of justice, right? But again, you're thinking here that the examples you're going to get here are going to be like the sorts of things that Plato would have thought were perfect forms. Virtue, courage, the good, the true, the beautiful, right? I mean, some people make that argument, Khalid, and I don't want to be facetious or I don't want to discourage the making of such an argument, but I don't think it's a particularly good one, because I think that morality actually precedes religion. Morality is something humans did long before we did anything like what we would recognize as religion today. Um, but let's say that you do make that argument and your sense of justice comes from like God or something, right? Rather than religion, say that it's God who instills a sense of justice or a sense of the good, right? That would still, I would say, be a case of like a non-physical abstract universal, right? You see what I mean? In fact, the Neoplatonic philosophers, they thought Plato's forms were like the ideas of God. They thought, oh, Plato got a lot of stuff about God right, even though Plato didn't believe in the Christian God, including the forms, which, if they're like abstract, universal sort of ideas, then maybe why they're abstract and universal is because they're God's ideas, right? Galen says, I think they play into each other. Yeah, there's a back and forth. There's a bit of a back and forth, sure. But one of the things I think is really cool about the ancient Greeks is that they developed um, theories of morality that were entirely separate from what they understood as mythos, which is not exactly religion, but um, Plato didn't want this stuff to come from the gods. He wanted this stuff to be knowable by via the intellect, you know? And Aristotle too. For Aristotle, morality is something you practice. You have to literally practice it. You get better at it the older you get, the wiser you get, etc. Again, from faith, no, I don't think so. And the reason I say this again is because, um, fundamentally, what we are social beings. And if you look at like other non-human animals, you can find examples of not, we don't call it moral behavior, but we kind of operationalize it as pro-social and anti-social behavior. Yeah. Like animals don't have religion. They do have pro-social behavior, which is just an operationalist term for morality. Um, Even chimpanzees. Actually, there's a great documentary on Netflix. I've recommended it to classes before. It's called Chimp Empire, and it's about like the largest troop of chimpanzees that scientists have studied out in the wild. And it's not like a scholarly source, but it does give you a really interesting close-up look into chimpanzee society. And you can see how they have like morality and politics and like they're so human-like. It's almost uncanny. Um, and our ancestors would have probably had similar stuff going on. Anyway, I don't want to get off track. Oh, it's so cold. Here we go. The Meno. Virtue is another example of a sort of abstract universal. Socrates and Meno in the eponymous dialogue are having a discussion about the nature of virtue, and Socrates says to Meno, I seem to be in luck. I wanted one virtue, and I find that you have a whole swarm of virtues to offer. Yeah, in this dialogue, Socrates is like, tell me about virtue, and Meno names a bunch of particular virtues like strength, courage, temperance, right? These are all virtues, and Socrates is like, what do you mean strength is a virtue? What do you mean you're showing me all of these virtues, but I want to know what virtue is, right? So Socrates continues seriously to carry on this metaphor of the swarm. Suppose I asked you what a bee is, what is its essential nature? And you reply that bees were of many different kinds. What would you say if I went on to ask, and is it in being bees that they are many and various and different from one another? Or would you agree that it is not in this respect that they differ? Then do the same with the virtues. Even if they are many and various, yet at least they all have some common character which makes them virtues. So Socrates in this little passage is relying on attribute agreement and abstract reference, right? These virtues that he's after are identified as such because they share a common set of attributes and because we're referring to virtue in the abstract. So similarly, more couple more concrete examples, right? We can identify dogs as dogs because they share a common set of attributes: four legs, mammals, bark, etc. That's what Socrates wants to do with the virtues. Um, and Socrates kind of requires that the virtues exist. Um, we'd have to acknowledge the existence of a form of virtue, I think, is what Socrates is trying to get us to do, right? So, um, a realist would say that the best explanation for the meaning of sentences such as Rover is a dog or courage is a virtue is that the words dog or the word virtue refer to universals that exist over and above the particular instances. And for Plato, these were the forms. That's strong realism in a nutshell. Oh, it's so cold. Maybe if I sit behind this tree. Nope. Whew. Okay, are there any questions? We are actually going pretty fast. I'm kind of worried that there's not enough questions. Do you guys understand Plato's ideas here? Just checking in, just making sure. Good. So really what a realist like Plato is doing is kind of relying on two sorts of arguments, an argument from attribute agreement and an argument from abstract reference. An argument from attribute agreement here says that universals are necessary to explain attribute agreement, right? Like why do these different objects agree in a certain attribute, like green? How can we have all these different green objects? Well, um, there's a universal, green, and all these different objects just instantiate that attribute. And the argument from abstract reference says that universals are necessary to explain the meaning of sentences that make use of abstract reference. So if I'm referring to something in the abstract, like green is a color, I need the universal color for that sentence to mean something. Oh, really? Go ahead. Tell us why, Sohaila. Or
To be like I
oh,
don't know, like
yeah. Sorry.
I
Go
feel
ahead.
like he's using still universals to explain the existence of universal in a way.
Okay. Well, I think what he's identified is a sort of necessary or potentially necessary theoretical item. But but there is a worry of not quite a circle, but an infinite regress coming up,
Yeah.
and that's the third man argument, right? That's actually I maybe you're talking about the third man argument, um, which kind of poses a problem for Plato and Socrates. So let's look at the third man argument. So if we go just to this second point here, in the Parmenides, where we have the character Socrates talking with Parmenides, the philosopher, this is a young version of the character Socrates talking to a pre-Socratic philosopher named Parmenides. That's where we get uh, Plato kind of giving us a counter argument against his own position. That's the third man argument. Um, what this argument is meant to show is that by accepting the attribute agreement, the argument from attribute agreement for the existence of universals, we actually open the door to this infinite regress. So here's an example. Let us say that there are two large objects. The Platonic realist would say they're large by virtue of the fact that both of them instantiate this property, largeness. So they agree in their attribute of largeness. And you might think, oh, what's the problem? Well, this is the problem. Parmenides says to Socrates in this dialogue, but now take largeness itself, the universal, and take the other things which are large. Suppose you look at all these in the same way in your mind's eye. Will not yet another unity make its appearance? A largeness, another universal, by virtue of which they all appear large? So it would seem, replies Socrates. And Parmenides continues, if so, a second form of largeness will present itself over and above largeness itself, and the things that share in it. And again, covering all these, yet another, which will make all of them large. So each of your forms will no longer be one, but an indefinite number. So, what does that mean in simple terms? Well, the universal is used to explain the attribute agreement between these two large individuals. So, we've got our universal of largeness to explain the likeness that all large objects have with one another. But Parmenides is saying, well, now if you're gonna have this one form of largeness to explain the attribute agreement between all large objects, now you need a second form to explain the agreement between the form of largeness and all the large objects. And then if you do that, you need another form to explain the agreement between that second large form of largeness, the first one, and all the large objects, so on ad infinitum, to infinity. And that's an infinite regress. Whenever we whenever we run into an infinite regress in philosophy, that signals that we're in a little bit of trouble and we need to go back to the drawing board, as it were. Oh my goodness, it's cold. Ooh, so, any questions about the third man argument before I freeze to the picnic table here? All right, well, we're almost done, actually. Um, so the we've seen how realists use um universals to deal with the to deal with attribute agreement, right? The argument from um or sorry, not attribute agreement, abstract reference. Uh but now we have to deal with now we have to answer whether the argument from attribute agreement really works by addressing the one over many problem. Here's a way we can look at it. Oh, I'm so cold. If the universal is like the particulars, okay, could be that way. It could also not be like the particulars. If it's like its particulars, then we get the third man argument again. But if universals aren't like their particulars, like largeness is not in itself large, um, then we've got a problem. If the universal is not like its particulars, then what's important is maybe not the resemblance the particulars bear toward the universal, but the relations between the universal and this instance of it and that instance of it. So now it seems like we still need another concept to cover each particular relation between the universal and its instances. So again, another kind of worry about a sort of infinite regress. But should we really be worried about all of this? After all, universals seem necessary uh, for thinking and for speaking, for communicating with one another. And Parmenides himself in the dialogue, the character, I should know, not the real Parmenides, but the character that Plato is writing for us, says, on the other hand, if, in view of these difficulties and other things like them, a man refuses to admit that the form of things exist or to distinguish a definite form in every case, he will have nothing on which to fix his thought. So long as he will not allow that each thing has a character which is always the same, in so doing, will completely destroy the significance of all discourse. But of that consequence, I think you are referring to Socrates are only too well aware. So Parmenides is saying, maybe universals, I mean, in spite of all the problems, like the one over many problem and the third man argument, we still kind of need something to anchor the meaning of our thought and our language. And it's universals that do that. So these universals are fixed and they're unfixed and unchanging, yet they fix the meaning of our references to particular objects in language. And they also fix the meaning of the references of our thoughts. And here Baylis makes a similar point to Plato's Parmenides. The existence of communicable knowledge requires shared meanings. Such knowledge in its simplest form is knowledge of the common characters exhibited by various objects and events. Our problem is to explain uh, universal's nature and their function in knowledge in terms that are neither mystical nor false to the facts of conscious communication. This is why, if you're a realist, universals are necessary. They explain our ability to talk and to think, and they anchor our shared knowledge about the essential nature of things. All right, what's happening in the chat? Pernille says, could universals just be a way to classify relations between objects in a coherentist way? Can there be a strand of the web that can be understood as universal? Yeah, I mean, this is kind of I think this is maybe like what Abelard says, which we're going to get to toward the end of our next lecture. which will take place the Tuesday after reading week. But it's possible. I would keep that in mind for when we talk about conceptualism. Now, that's actually all I have for today, which is nice because although we are ending early, it is incredibly cold uh, out here. I'm definitely going to have to find some place to hole up inside Taranga Commons for the winter term. That will be difficult, and there's going to be all people everywhere. So hopefully it works. But that's all I have in terms of material. Yeah, but the library's too far away from my next class. Yeah, I wish. I wish I could get one. Um, it's all right. I will sort something out. But are there any questions? Yeah, I get a tent. Well, then I have to set the tent up and tear it down. Oh, I might just have to deal with it. Um, are there any questions before we go? If there aren't any questions, then I'm happy to end early and to wish you all a lovely reading week. Oh, the quiz. I released the grades for That's what I wanted to tell you. I released the grades for the quizzes. Yeah, thank you, Hannah, for the question. Yeah, the quiz grades are open. You should be able to. I don't know how this works on the student side of Brightspace, but you can review your quiz feedback. You can look at your grades. If there's feedback comments, you can read them. I want to say everybody did really well. Um, and also, a couple of the TAs noticed that some of you were not very confident in your answers. Like, you'd give the answer and then maybe you'd say, "Oh, I think that's right. I'm not sure if I got it right." And I just wanted to say, like, you should all be confident in your answers, okay? You're a smart bunch of people. So be confident in your answers. Yeah. Really show me that you should have a grade. Yeah. Yeah. So I'll share some instructions. Yeah, don't look at the grade book. Look at the quizzes. I'll post some instructions on the Discord server after my next class in case you're not sure. But yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good reading week. Stay warm, stay safe, get rested, and I'll see you the week after next week. All right. Bye for now, everyone.